2 weeks from one of the most consequential elections in American history, and the candidates are putting on a full court press to pick up Latino voters. Former President Donald Trump holding a roundtable discussion with Latino leaders at his Miami golf club today, and responding to criticism, he instructed Republicans not to move forward with a bipartisan deal on the border earlier this year.
And then they complain about a bill. It's a phony deal. It's a scam. There's no bill. I never had a bill. All you have to do as president, wake him up and say, Joe, we need you to say close the border. That's what I did.
That's right.
I just said we're closing the border.
Our contributor, Maria Elena Salinas, joining us with more. So the Latino electorate has grown in most of the battleground states, right? They're also voting Republican in much larger numbers than we've seen in the past, especially in Florida. We know this isn't, a monolithic group, but what do you make of what's happening right now?
Well, as far as Florida is concerned, today, former President Trump told the people gathered there that Vice President Kamala Harris is a leftist radical and many of the other insults that we have come to hear in his events. But Trump is in friendly territory in Florida, so he probably feels most comfortable talking to this crowd. And Trump is now leading Vice President Harris with Hispanics in Florida with somewhere around 54, 56% of the vote. Now, what is surprising about this is that this would be the very first time in over 20 years that a majority of Latinos support a Republican candidate here in Florida. And it's to be expected. It's a very different electorate from the rest of the Latinos. Besides the economy, inflation, crime, their issue here is socialism. Trump has successfully painted Vice President Harris as a socialist with this community that has exiles from Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, many of them who fled left-wing totalitarian regimes in their home countries. And, sometimes it feels like they are exploiting their pain. Florida is an outlier, though, Kira, in that sense, because it's the only state where Trump leads with Latino voters. Nationally and in some of the battleground states, Vice President Harris still is leading with Latinos, although her lead is smaller than previous Democratic candidates.
So let's just go back and talk about Trump's campaign, and how it's been using anti-immigration rhetoric from almost the moment he came down that golden escalator in 2015. And it continues now with lies about the migrant community, specifically in Springfield, Ohio. But he got huge cheers at that roundtable today for his harsh border policies. What does that tell you?
Well, that's not necessarily a big issue for Latinos, especially Latino leaders here, most of whom are a part of the Cuban-American community. We still have a lot of immigrants in the state from Central America, some from Mexico who come here, they're farm workers, and they are very concerned with that kind of rhetoric, but not necessarily in the type of people that he was with at that roundtable. But when it comes to immigration, we're seeing a dramatic change in Latino voters' views. Traditionally, they have leaned Democratic, in part because of the promise of that immigration reform that would open the door to the legalization of undocumented immigrants who have been living here for decades, who have roots, who may have, U.S.-born children, and also for dreamers. But that immigration reform did not materialize. So now what we see is a growing number of Latino voters who favor hardline positions on the border, not just here in Florida, but across the country. They support building the wall, and some even support mass deportations. And it's a very complex situation because mass deportation would mean separating families and maybe even deporting family members of those who support that policy. There's around 22 million people in the U.S. that live in mixed status households where there's at least one member who's undocumented. And then there are, of course, many reasons for that change in views. It's partly because they don't want to be associated with what they perceive to be chaos at the border. Many are second, third, even fourth generation Latinos that don't have that identity with their heritage that previous generations like mine had. There was a New York Times poll recently that showed that when Trump vilifies immigrants, saying that they are criminals or that they are poisoning the blood of the country, when he uses that kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric, 2/3 of Latino voters said that they don't feel that he's talking about them. Those are other immigrants, not me, not my family, not my friends. And that's one of the most surprising things that I have seen about Latinos in this election cycle.
Oh, yeah, that is very interesting. Well, then we've got the Democratic side. Harris has highlighted how she'd create more opportunities for Latino men in particular. That's a group that polls show have been sort of drifting to the GOP. What do you make of the growing gender gap among non-white voters now?
Yeah, it's interesting. The majority of Latinas still are supporting Vice President Harris in higher numbers than men, especially young Latino men. But because for Latinas, reproductive rights are a big issue, not the top issue, but it is influencing their vote. Not so much for Latino men. Trump's behavior and his insults towards immigrants do not seem to bother Latino men. Some even find his rhetoric entertaining. They identify with his bravado, and I have to say here that there's a macho component to it. And of course, it's also the economy, since young men, particularly Black and Latino young men, are falling behind their female counterparts in college attainment and entrepreneurship. That's why, as you mentioned, Vice President Harris has now she's specifically courting Latino men. And just like she did with Black men, she just announced that opportunity agenda for Latino men that includes lowering cost, increasing home ownership, and expanding job opportunities. But, even though Latinos are everywhere, and there's hundreds of thousands of them in some of these battleground states, it all depends on last minute effort to get them to register to vote and to get them to go out and vote.
Maria Elena Salinas, always appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thank you, Kira.